Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. This paper is joined with Shankar Satyanath, who's a political scientist at NYU, and then Hans-Joachim Voth, who's now in Zurich. So let me start by giving you a definition of social capital, because there can be some confusion sometimes. So the way in which we think of social capital for the context of this study is as a dense network of civic associations. Right? So, or if you use the definition by Durloff and Favchamp in their book, then it's the study of social capital is that of network-based processes that generate beneficial outcomes through norms and trust. Right? So there's a huge literature that has shown that social capital is typically associated with positive economic and social outcomes. So you have papers or arguments by Tocqueville, then books by Putnam who show that social capital is associated with a vigorous democracy. Then you have in a cross-section Knack and Käfer who show that where you have more social capital, higher social capital, people more cooperating, you have more economic development. Or a famous paper by Guiso, Sapienza, Zingales show that much of the difference in northern and southern Italy might actually be due to northern Italy having more social capital. Right? So huge literature showing that social capital has a positive side. And then also emerging more recently and a little smaller literature that points to the possibility that social capital might have a dark side. So there are papers and authors who argue that social capital might lead to social polarization. So in a way, if you get these exclusive clubs, gentlemen's clubs or so, you need to be rich to be a member of this club, then this type of social capital would not necessarily generate positive outcomes. Or some studies have shown that these criminal networks, they look much like social capital. Right? And a recent paper in the JPE by Acemoglu, Reed, and Robinson, they look at chiefs in Sierra Leone, and they actually show that these autocratic rulers, these chiefs, use social capital to entrench themselves. It's like capture of civic society. So what we learn from this is that social capital can actually contribute to the persistence of bad institutions. Now the question that we're asking in this paper is, could there be an even darker side of social capital? In particular, could it be that social capital could also contribute to the fall of democracy and therefore to the emergence of bad institutions in the first place? Okay. So we have to pick a bad institution, right? What we're going to pick is this. All know that Nazi Germany, the most infamous autocracy or totalitarian regime in human history, terrible consequences, Second World War, Holocaust. Before I get into more detail on what we are doing, let me tell you how people, especially in sociology, have typically thought about what could explain this rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. So an important strand of the sociological literature says that the rise of mass society and the corresponding decline of traditional ties might be responsible for the Nazi Party becoming attractive for people. So in particular, if you think of, so mass society is basically these large-scale, impersonal social institutions replacing your local networks. Right? So if 500 years ago something happened to you, you used your neighbors and friends, your local community who would help you. In a mass society, you just use an anonymous doctor, or if you get unemployed, you get unemployment support from the anonymous state institutions. Okay? So these local ties are not there anymore, and this then in these arguments results in these, marginal loners, people at the fringes of society, and people such as Hannah Arendt have argued that these are the people, these marginal loners, who are most susceptible to entering the Nazi Party. Or as Stern put it in 1972, Germany lacked the kind of voluntary civic activity that attracted their English and American counterparts. Okay, so summarizing this, then mass movements such as the National Socialists in Germany or the Communists supposedly offered an alternative identity to these marginal loners. So what this would mean is that the weakness of German civic society would actually explain the rise of the Nazi Party. Okay? But there are also alternative arguments. So there's a political scientist, Sheryl Berman, who wrote a paper in 1997 saying that, well, actually, if we look at the density of associations in Germany, the civic associations, then they're not much different from other countries in Western and Central Europe. So if anything, Germany actually had a relatively dense associational life. And then she argued that the Nazis exploited these associations. Right? And that's exactly our starting point. So where Berman stops, that's where we continue. So she made this argument, but she didn't provide a detailed cross-sectional evidence. In fact, some people who have argued against this said, well, this is possible. So it's possible that Germany had a dense associational life, but if it hadn't had this, the Nazis would have risen even faster. Right? So it's not that it contributed, it could have even stopped them, this dense associational life. So the only way to shed light on this is or one way which we propose here is to collect cross-sectional data within Germany and look at regions with denser civic association activity, and then say if these regions see indeed a faster rise of the Nazi party. So that's what we're doing here. Okay, so we construct a novel data set for association density in more than 100 towns and cities in Germany. So how do you do this? Basically, you write to cities whether they have surviving directories from the 1920s. And if they do, you ask them to kindly provide these, and then you can code these civic associations. Okay? So we show that there's, and this is really the main finding, there's a strong and robust relationship between the density of associations and Nazi party entry. So the whole paper in one graph is this. So this is time on the y-axis, on the x-axis. You see that Nazi party entries start around 1925. The party is founded a little earlier in 1919, but there's not really massive entry before the mid-1920s. And what we do here is we split the sample by association density. So these are these black dots represent cities in the highest tercile of association density. So these would be cities with a dense associational life, middle tercile, and then lowest tercile. So the blue dots here are cities where you have relatively few associations. And then you track Nazi party entry over time, and you see that there's a substantial difference. Okay? So the cities in the lowest tercile of association density, they see much slower Nazi party entry than the other cities. And if you translate this into numbers, then in the lowest tercile, you see on average over this period 22 entries per 1,000 inhabitants per year over this period, whereas in cities with, in the highest tercile of association density, you see 37 entries per year and per 1,000 inhabitants. Okay, so it's a pretty substantial difference. Okay. And of course, now the rest of the talk is going to show you that this is not just a spurious relationship and so on, doing all the economist stuff. Right? So we show that these results are equally strong for bowling, singing, and animal breeding clubs. So it's not just that all of these are military associations. Right? So it works equally well if you look at the animal breeders. We're going to... rabbits, for example, really peaceful animals. And then we're going to address concerns of endogeneity. There are going to be some caveats, but we're pretty confident in our results. And then we're going to show, so when is it that social capital actually has a dark side? So why is it that in much of the literature we find a strong positive effect of having more social interactions? But in this particular context, we find that there's a negative or a dark side. And we're going to show that there's an important interaction with local institutions. In particular, we're going to give you the punchline already, and I'll tell you again afterwards so you can kind of fall asleep in between, where you have stable local institutions. These actually prevent that the Nazi party can exploit these existing social relationships. Okay? So where stable institutions signal to the public that anti-democratic organizations such as the Nazi Party will be fought against consistently, that's where the Nazi Party is not successful at exploiting social capital. Whereas where you have a lot of local government turnover, unstable institutions, that's where the Nazi Party is successful at exploiting social capital for the negative. All right, some background, just very quickly. So the Nazi Party was founded in 1919, right after the First World War. In 1923, famous attempt to overthrow the government, the beer hall putsch in Munich. Party was then banned in 1924. It went back to the polls in 1928, then received relatively few votes in 1928. The first time it really got a lot of votes was already in 1930. Right? But long before it succeeded at the polls, it attracted a lot of members. So it had, by 1933, already almost 1 million members. And there are historians who say that the SA, who are kind of the military police style Nazis, they would have been strong enough to challenge the government militarily. So they're a very powerful organization. So why is it that party entry actually matters? So why don't we only look at election outcomes? Why do we look at party entry? Well, first of all, membership expansion via these local party cells was really important as a precondition for later electoral success. And this was because where you had more members, you could collect more membership dues to finance your election campaigns. Members were also important for mobilization, leaflets, and so on. And we're going to show you that entry rates into the Nazi Party predict later election success. Okay, so where the party managed to attract more voters, more members, they also later got more voters. Okay. So why is it that, or in which exact way does the mechanism work? So how is it that the Nazi Party could exploit these associations? I'll give you some examples, but I'll be quick. So these town chapters, or in German, as they're called Ortsgruppen, they were responsible for recruiting members. They were collecting these dues, as I said before, and they were coordinating local activities. So there's scholar Koscher, who analyzed the case of Marburg in great detail. So he basically looked at people who were at the same time entering the Nazi Party, but also members in associations. And just to give you some examples, so there's a guy, Emil Wissner, who was a member of a white-collar employee association. He was active in 2 gymnastic clubs. He then joined the Nazi Party in 1929, and he immediately used his other memberships in order to convince members of these gymnast and white-collar worker associations to also join the Nazi Party. So the Nazi Party actually encouraged their local cells and their local cell leaders to actively seek to exploit these associations. There's another nice example of a party member who tells the story that he became acquainted with a colleague of his own age with whom he had frequent conversations, and then he was a calm, quiet person whom I esteemed very highly. When I found out that he was one of the local leaders of the National Socialist Party, my opinion of it as a group of criminals changed completely. Okay, so you have this negative opinion, rightly so, about the Nazis, but then one of your trusted friends from the local rabbit breeding club tells you that he's a member. This might completely change the way in which you think about these. This is just some more detail on who were the actual, or what were the associations that Nazi members were also members in. So now you take this paper by Koscher and you look at the city of Marburg, where you have the data. And this is basically, you take the Nazi Party members for Marburg between 1923 and 35, and then you see which other associations are they members in. Okay? And in particular, we were concerned that this finding might really just be driven by all these Nazi Party members also being members in kind of military associations, right? These or right-wing associations. But this doesn't seem to be the case. So you have a lot of students, occupational associations, sports associations, and only then fourth, political parties, veterans, nationalists. So these were the kind of associations we worry about, but we can exclude these and we find the same results. And then you have community action, cultural, and so on. Okay. So some more on the data. We have collected data for 111 towns and cities. Altogether, this is more than 8,500 associations. On average, there are 2.28 associations per 1,000 inhabitants. And the conditions to be in the sample are then, we wrote to all these towns, as I said before. Then these towns need to have surviving directories. And this is, of course, not the case for many of the towns, because either they didn't have these in the first place or they were destroyed in the Second World War. But there's really no systematic pattern in the data that you miss data from a certain area or you have more from another area. Our core measure is association density. So here's one limitation. Unfortunately, we only have number of associations per capita, not members in associations per capita. Okay? But where data is available, for a few cases, we find a very strong correlation between number of associations per capita and association members per capita. Okay? So it seems to be a reasonable proxy. And you also find the same thing in the US, where Putnam has done studies on this in a lot of detail. We then, of course, we don't have data on every single Nazi Party member, but fortunately there's this project called the Berlin, Minnesota sample of Nazi Party members by Schneider and Hase. And these people sampled 42,000 Nazi Party members. And then you have very detailed information on these. So out of these, we managed to match 6,500 to our 111 towns. And if you take the population share in all of Germany of our 111 towns, it's about the same share as these 6,500 in 42,000. So it matches well. Right?
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
Do you worry at all about selection into disappearing? So say that eventually I think the Nazis get to be the dominant force everywhere. I go back to the country that the county or a town that the local clubs were not really welcoming of me. I guess I would just obliterate them. So in the end of the day, what I get 90 years later is that in places where actually the local clubs were welcoming, they were not, well, they were respected by the Nazis, and that's, they get more membership. But those in counties or villages that the Nazis, none of the clubs won't welcome them, when Nazis lost in power, basically they went back and killed them, whatever. They said, you did not accept us in the first time, we're going to actually destroy you. I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud now, I don't know if you have heard any evidence along these lines. Given that Nazi guys are not really, are not known to be very respectful of differences in opinions, I would think that this would be a major...
So, okay, so just to make sure I understood the question, but then I get one more minute in the end, right? I'm supposed to repeat the question anyway. So are you asking whether there's selective destruction of archives or something?
Yes, that's it, exactly. Were the Nazis destroyed anything, or they were basically equally nice to all?
Okay, so the nice thing about this is these, so the Nazi membership cards, they were all held centrally in Berlin, and they only survived because the Russians moved in just a couple of minutes before they were about to be destroyed. But these were centrally...
Were the club's records destroyed because the Nazis...
Oh, the club's records. I thought you meant them...
Local clubs didn't adopt the Nazi ideology. The Nazi Party later moved in, wiped out the clubs, and wiped out any record that they ever existed. And so in those places that didn't early on adopt Nazism, is it the case that the Nazis wiped out any evidence that there were social clubs?
Okay, so then, okay, at this point, it's getting, so we're, yeah. Okay, so was there?
Can I just say
yeah.
That's the last question.
Sorry.
That's exactly what I was about to say. So now it's getting kind of complex. But I'm still going to answer it. So the question now, for the record, is: was there selective destruction of city directories? Right? I think this is a very faint possibility, because if you have locally these Nazis, then what they would probably care about is destroy their membership records. But they won't make the kind of connection that there's a rabbit breeding association that doesn't even list their names, right? It's just listed in the local directory. So I find it very unlikely that old Nazis or Nazis at the end of World War II, the last couple of days, would strategically go and destroy city directories, because their names would typically not even be listed in these. Okay. All right, so let's move on. Without any more questions, I don't know if you can see the light dots. So there's these light dots, which mean cities with below median association density, and then the dark blue dots are cities with above median association density. So what this does is this graph, it shows you at the same time that we have a pretty broad coverage for Germany, and at the same time there's not just local clusters of high versus low association density. So these are pretty scattered across Germany, which is good for identification, right? Because if you just had all the dark blue dots in the south and all the white dots in the north, you would have reason to worry that there's something else going on. All right. Just overview of the variables. So the main message here, don't even stare at all these numbers. Main message is that our sample is relatively similar to the urban averages in Germany. So it's pretty representative of urban areas in Germany overall. Then we can look at balancedness, which of course you want to know whether there's something else that is different for cities that have higher association density versus cities that have low association densities. So we do this comparison of correlates, and some of these are significant. These that are significant, they're our baseline controls, such as population. We always control for population, population square, and so on, log population. You can't kill the effect. Then share of Catholics, and share of blue-collar workers, so all these go into our baseline controls. But they also don't vary hugely across these cities with high and low association density. And if you run these omnibus tests where you basically show whether altogether there's imbalancedness of the sample, there's no strong reason to believe that this is the case. Okay, so baseline results. This is regressing Nazi Party entry rates between 1925 and 33. On association density, and you see this, that there's a very strong effect if you use all associations. It's a bit weaker, but still highly significant for non-military, and similar for military associations. Right? And then also, if you include all controls, you find the same kind of effects. And so, main message here, where you had higher association density in the early 1920s, that's where the Nazi Party rose significantly faster in terms of membership entry. This is a scatter plot for the regressions that I've just shown you. So you see that this is not just driven by outliers, and because someone is going to raise their arms and say there are two outliers, let me show you the graph without these two. Oops, no, this doesn't work anymore. Okay, here we go. So this is just excluding these two cities at the top, and you still get highly significant relationship with a t-statistic of 2.7. So you still have the three stars. Okay? So it's not just outliers that drive this relationship. Okay. What we do then, and this is a huge jump. So in the paper, there's a lot of stuff in between. If I have time, I'm going to talk about that. But this is looking at election outcomes. Because in the end, the fall of democracy was not directly because of Nazi Party membership, but because eventually in 1933, the Nazi Party did actually win the majority of the votes. Well, it's a lot more complex than this, but this is a kind of simplified short talk story. So here we take first party entry in 1925 till 1928, till 1930, till 1933 for the different election years, and you see that party entry is a strong predictor of electoral success. Okay? So cities that see a lot of entry of members into the Nazi Party also see higher votes for the Nazi Party. And then you can do this as a two-stage least square setup, where you basically say, let's take local association density to predict Nazi Party entry, and then predicted Nazi Party members to look at its effect on vote outcomes. And you get the same effects. This does not mean that you can interpret this causally. That's why I say 2SLS and not IV for kind of subtle difference. Okay? So it's just to show you that there's a first stage and then there's a second stage. We're going to do something that's closer to actual IV in a second. Right? Okay, so message so far, where you have higher association densities in these cities, you see more entry into the Nazi Party, and you also see that the Nazi Party is more successful at the polls. We do a whole bunch of additional results. How much time do I have? This means infinite.
You use 25 minutes, and then you get 10 more, and then 3 for interruptions.
Okay, so I have 13 minutes. Okay, very good. 18 minutes. Oh, that's okay. Then I can show you at least two of these interesting things. So when was association density most important? Or when did higher association density help the Nazis most? Under which conditions? That's what we asked next. And what we find is that on the one hand, if you look at cities, and I'm just going to talk about it, I'm not even going to show you the regression. So if you look at cities that in the early 1920s had a lot of votes for right-wing extremist parties that are not the Nazi Party. Okay? So these parties decline over time. They merge more towards the political center. So some supporters will be frustrated because they used to support their right-wing party, which now moves towards the center, joins the government in some regions. So where do they go? They typically join the Nazi Party. Okay? So where you have more of these early 1920s right-wing parties, the Nazi Party grows faster. but the effect, the marginal effect of association density is actually weaker there. Okay? So maybe I do show you the regression because you look puzzled. So let's just look at the two subsamples, okay? So this DVP is a German nationalist party, and we look at the votes for this party in 1924. Okay? Which is a nice year because the Nazi Party was prohibited, so the Nazi Party doesn't possibly interfere with the results for the DVP here. So we kind of expect that regions that see high votes for this German Nationalist Party in 1924, they have a high pool of potential voters for the Nazi Party. Now you look at Nazi Party entry rates and regress it on association density, you get a very strong positive effect in regions where you actually have a smaller pool of kind of natural supporters for the Nazi Party. Whereas you have a small effect where you have a larger pool of natural supporters. So why is this? Our interpretation is the following. Where you don't already have a lot of people who are going to come to you no matter what, that's where it really matters that the Nazi Party can exploit these social connections via associations. Okay? And this would be exactly this result for cities that have low initial votes for these right-wing parties. On the other hand, if you take cities where already a lot of people vote for the right-wing nationalists, there it's relatively easy for the Nazis to attract new members, no matter if there's high association density or not. Okay, so the extra bang that you get out of associations is smaller where you already have a large pool of people who are of potential supporters. Okay. And let's go back. Then similarly, we find that the effects are stronger for early entry than for later entry. And this is also compatible with the previous interpretation, which is if you're a completely new party, no one knows you, that's when it's particularly useful to exploit these social connections because that's how people learn about you. Okay? Whereas for later entries, and late here means for us after 1929, the Nazi Party is already much more established, much more well-known there. These associational connections are less crucial to help the rise of the Nazis. We do a bunch of counterfactuals. So in particular, you see no effect for communist votes. You see no effect for other right-wing parties after 1928, when the Nazi Party is running itself. And then we move on. Some robustness checks, so we can include additional controls. We can run this for small or large cities. Cities with a lot of Catholics or few Catholics, cities with a lot of blue-collar workers or not, and we always find similar effects. Then we can run this for bonding versus bridging social capital. So basically bonding social capital is associations that bring together people who already belong to a, say, consistent social group, so such as gentlemen's clubs or golf clubs or something like this, whereas bridging social capital are associations that bring together people from different social backgrounds. And we find that there's an effect for both bridging and bonding associations. Okay. And then a bunch of other robustness checks. Okay, so last 10 minutes, let me try to move towards causality. So there's a number of concerns. So for example, it could be that there are just cities where, in general, people are more social, and that's why they enter all kinds of associations more easily, and then the Nazi Party rises, and they also enter the Nazi Party more rapidly. There's one direct thing that we can do to address this, which is we can look at other party vote outcomes. So if this was true, right, then it should also work for, say, the communists. So the communists should also be able to exploit the social associations. But they don't, so we don't see any relationship for communist votes and association density. Another thing we can do is we can run a IV analysis where our instrument is based on membership in gymnast associations in the 1860s. And then also in 1861, there was the Nuremberg Singing Festival where people from all over Germany went to sing together, basically. And we have the data on the associations that participated and the cities that they came from. Okay? So there's 283 singing associations. You have almost 20,000 participants. And we actually have the number of participants as well. One of them was Friedrich Nietzsche. You might have heard of him. Of course, exclusion restriction here is So it could be, and it's actually historically true, that some of these ideas, especially at the Singer Festival, was German nationalism, but not the same kind of nationalism as the Nazi National Socialism. Right? So this is more, let's unify Germany as a country and all have a great time, but not let's unify Germany and conquer everyone else. Okay? So there's a huge difference. The spirit of 1848 is really very different from the spirit of 1933 or 39. So then also what helps us is that these earlier associations, like the gymnasts or these singers, they mostly turned apolitical after 1850. So you already see what we're going to do is we're going to use the association density from the mid-19th century to predict association density in the 1920s. First stage works quite well, so this is just report the p-value for the first stage, which is pretty strong. And then second stage results are also quite robust and strong and larger than OLS, which is what you usually get. One explanation for why these results are larger than OLS is actually that for these gymnasts and the singers, we do observe the actual members and not just the number of clubs. Okay, so it's measured in a more precise way. So one excuse that you always have when you find higher IV coefficients is that you address implicitly measurement error by your two-step strategy. And I think here this is really a valid excuse because we do observe these historical associations with members and not just numbers of associations. Okay. Of course, some concerns remain. So you could still say, well, maybe there's still something in the air, something that's different in these cities. And it was already different in 1860 that we can't address. Okay? At least we can't address it with these IV results. What we can address for sure is that there's some kind of reverse causality, something specific to the 1920s, making these cities more attractive for both association membership and Nazi Party membership at the same time. What we can also do is we can check that, in fact, our instruments, they're uncorrelated with extreme votes for the right before 1924. Okay, so it really just seems to start to matter after 1924 when the Nazi Party rises. Okay. Another thing we can do is, I don't know if you've seen this, these plausibly exogenous. So that's what people do more and more. So that's basically you say, what if my instrument also had a direct effect on the outcome variable? How large could the direct effect be? And my instrument would still be reasonable. And it turns out that the direct effect would have to be half as large as the total effect, which is, well, I think we're pretty much on the safe side. And then you can do Altonji et al. So if you don't believe these and these, then IV is agreed that it has some downsides, but I think it's an important step in the right direction here. Okay. And then finally, in the last, what do we have, 6 minutes, 5 minutes? So let's try to understand when it is that social capital will end up having a dark side and when it is that it has the usual positive effects. So as I said before, there's a lot of evidence for positive effects of social capital. What we find on average in Weimar Germany is that it had a negative effect. It helped the Nazis to rise. So our answer here is that there's an important interaction with institutions. And in particular, if you have strong, stable institutions, then these can help to align expectations. So think about you're someone who thinks about entering the Nazi Party, and you expect some benefit from it. But the benefit will only realize when the Nazi Party takes over the government. All right? So it's kind of a bet, like a bet in a game of expectations. But then you see that the government is strong and it's cracking down on the Nazi Party assemblies and so on continuously. Then this might change your belief, and you're not going to expect the Nazi Party to succeed eventually, so you're not entering in the first place. Okay? So in this way, strong institutions can help to align expectations that democracy will prevail, and then it doesn't make any sense to enter an anti-democratic party. Also, another dimension is that in states with strong institutions, one example here within Germany is Prussia. So Prussia had strong institutions, and it would regularly crack down on these Nazi Party assemblies, but not only against the Nazis. Interestingly, they cracked down, the state of Prussia with strong institutions, they cracked down also against the left, the communists. Okay, so it's not just selective against the Nazis, but the communists are also anti-democratic, and they face strong opposition from the government as well. Okay, so what we do here is to proxy for stable institutions. This is important. We look at the fraction of time that the longest ruling coalition was in power between 1919 and 1932. Okay, so you take this time span of the Weimar Republic, and you look at the state level. So there's 16 states in Germany, and you look at within these states how stable was the government. So how long was the longest serving coalition in place? And this varies between, I think, around 30% for the worst states and basically 1% for the states with the most stable local institutions. And then in the interest of time, let's maybe just look at this last column. Okay, so just focus on this last column. So what you see here is if you interact association density with coalition stability, you get a strong negative interaction term. So what this means is that on average, higher association density means more Nazi party entry. But where institutions are strong, so where coalition stability is high, that's where this effect is weakened substantially. Okay? So the dark side of social capital is much weaker when it's confronted with strong local institutions. Okay? All right. And then you can also split the sample, so you can look at states with unstable institutions, states with stable institutions, and you see that this positive relationship between social capital and Nazi party entry is very, very strong in unstable states, but it's basically not existent in states with stable institutions. Okay. What's also, I have 2 minutes. Then I can tell you one more nice thing. So Prussia basically has strong local institutions until the late 1920s. But then eventually there's a coup d'etat by the central government taking over the Prussian government. And that's when Prussia becomes just as bad as Weimar Germany on average. So you can compare, is there a relationship between association density early on when Prussia had strong institutions? And it's positive, but it's not significant and it's relatively small. And then once Prussia was taken over by this coup d'etat by the central government and also had weak institutions in place, then you actually see a relationship. Okay, so this is another indicative piece of evidence. All right. So let me conclude. We showed that, or we first started with the observation that generally social capital is associated with positive outcomes. We showed that in the case of Nazi Germany, or in the rise of the Nazis in Germany, social capital actually had a dark side in the sense that it helped the Nazis to attract new members. We showed that there's a very strong relationship between local association density and entry into the Nazi party. This effect does not depend on the type of associations. Okay, so it's there for military associations, but also for rabbit breeders. And then there's an important interaction with institutions, which is that social capital can be exploited to the negative if it's in combination with weak institutions. And this is also the policy message. So this is the broader picture here is that there's so far two literatures that have been treated pretty much separately, which is social capital on the one hand and institutions on the other. And we show that there's an important interaction between the two. So there's a side effect of having good institutions or strong and stable institutions, which is that they also help to foster a positive effect of social capital. Okay. Thank you.
Take questions. I'm just a little worried that Som is going to ask whether Nietzsche belonged to a rabbit breeding institute. We'll just give first pitch to the students if there are any questions, and if not, James.
So, one, I think Skelly's question could be rephrased as all that stuff we did with balanced statistics, instead of comparing high membership to low membership, just compare in sample to not in sample in a sample of all German cities rather than just ones you get data on. I think that would be a concern. The actual question I had, being an Nazi sounds like a lot of work. There's the SA, that's an associational membership type thing. There's a Hitler Youth, that's an associational membership type thing. Can you separate out the possibility that the Nazis recruited through associations that existed from the Nazis just promoted an ideology of being the sort of citizen that's really involved in stuff, and so citizens who are just involved in everything see this as, yeah, that's the type of German I am.
Okay, so on the first question, first question was the selectiveness issue that was raised. We can partially at least address it by showing that the cities that make it into our sample look quite similar to the cities in Germany overall. And that's the case. So they look quite similar to the urban subsample. That was a table that I kind of skipped relatively quickly. The second question is, if I understand you correctly, you say, well, could it be that what's happening really is that the Nazi party rises and then it communicates to Germans, you shall be an individual that is member of associations and you also shall be member of the Nazi party, right? But I think this is a bit starting exposed, because you presume that the Nazi party already is there and powerful enough to convey this message to all Germans. But if anything, we find the strongest effects of associations in the early years of the Nazi party, of the rise of the Nazi party. So in 1925, when they were not successful at the polls, when I don't know if how many Germans knew about them, but they were not as popular that they could convey this this message in a powerful enough way for this kind of interpretation.
I mean, one possible, concern, but also potential opportunity is that, there's a lot of work on the risk. People join organizations to share risk, right? So even the rabbit breeder, so Daniel Chen's work in Indonesia and so on and so forth. So, I mean, and also, you think about the Nazis, a big part of their message was Arbeiten Brot, right? They're going to promise you working jobs, and that was part of their platform. So again, you could imagine that sort of, it could be that there's a sort of, there are certain people, certain cities have sort of a risk profile which is very conducive towards building these associations to mitigate the risk, as well as, a big, when the hyperinflation happens and all the rest of it, they actually get hit pretty badly. But that also suggests perhaps that you could sort of begin to get some identification of sort of risk shocks that happened in the 1860s or something. And maybe to sort of better justify the singing groups and so forth as a...
So to repeat the question, to make it short, I think, again, correct me if I'm wrong, the question is that could it just be that the underlying pattern really is risk aversion, and then you join associations if you're risk averse, because if something bad happens, your fellow rabbit breeders are going to be with you, right? And then could this be that this somehow fostered entry into the Nazi party when there was a bad shock? Okay, so let's look at the measure for a bad shock, which is at the height of the Depression, 1933, share of unemployed. And here you see that, if anything, it would go the other way around, because you have more unemployed and significantly more unemployed in cities that have below median association density. So where you have a lot of associations, you actually have less unemployment. So this just doesn't seem to go in the right direction. I don't know if I have to think more if this completely addresses your concern, but that's kind of the first order response, and it seems to go in the opposite direction. No.
So one thing that I was thinking during the talk, and I think this goes in your favor, is it the case that people joining the Nazi party actually are doing something evil when they're joining? And then, because the Nazi party had different ideology at different times. So you can imagine at different times they emphasize that they're like very communitarian. And so, you could imagine another way to reconcile this with the literature on social capital being a good thing is that, early on people thought that joining the Nazi party was a good thing, and being part of a social group led you to join. But I think that you guys found in other work that like in your early period when you find big effects, that's when the Nazi party was more anti-Semitic. And so I think that is additional evidence that this is really social capital allowing people to convince others of evil, which I think is actually pretty interesting. And I don't know, in the case of Prussia, things are a little bit later. But anyway, Prussia's a little bit different story. But I think your main effect is consistent with evil, right? Is that right? Is my memory correct?
Yeah. So the answer to this question, I won't repeat the question, but I think the answer is sufficient to also repeat implicitly the question. So your second point is right. And this is that in the early phase, in its early years until the 1930s, the Nazi Party was much more anti-Semitic and, as you called it, evil, which is probably very closely related, than as compared to the later years after 1930. And the reason is that early on they were this extremist party, but then they saw they were rising at the polls, and to attract a broad spectrum of voters, you have to drop these extreme values for at least for a number of years. So they kind of hide their true ambition behind a mask, then win the elections, and then rip off the mask again, right? And you're right, and this is a very good point. So in this sense, this is complementary to our story, that in these early years where the Nazi Party is particularly evil, it matters even more to exploit these social networks to kind of signal to people, well, that they're not that evil after all, or there's some whatever senseful argument, and yeah. No.
One last question, Michelle.
So I'm thinking about the dark side of human capital, and in some ways it's not that surprising, right? In any contracting or mechanism problem, here the social objective is democracy, and people collude, long-run players collude, or they cooperate. Since this might be new for the social capital literature, but in contracting or in mechanism design, you just know that sometimes called collusion, sometimes called cooperation.
Yeah.
And here you're finding evidence of collusion.
Yeah.
Which is
So I agree. From a theory perspective, this is not that astonishing. It's like a multiple equilibria story. But what's definitely novel and important in this context is the interaction that we document with institutions. So institutions can help you to move the effect from one to the other extreme, right? And this is something that would potentially allow you to extend your theory models.
So we should thank Nico for a fascinating paper.
Thank you.